say something about the strategic interests of the United States in targeting Iran. I look at the map. It's not too far from Russia. The U.S. strategic military focus has shifted to the east. That's public knowledge. Isn't Iran in the way? And is it so? Otherwise, how do you explain targeting this country that doesn't really present a military threat to the United States or the United States interests, but it's in the way of getting to Russia and China?
I think the concept of strategic areas might have been true like in the Great Game, 19th century, even in 20th century. Nowadays, with modern technology, missiles, space, I don't think the military really thinks in terms of that is important, that you need Iran to be able to weaken this Russia. I think that the vehement opposition to Iran is not about strategic. I don't think oil is an issue either. I think it's a question of power. U.S. is a dominant power, can't tolerate any state that crosses it. So if any state crosses it, it has to be beaten down, given as a lesson to others that if you do that, this is what will happen to you. And then the only way that those countries have actually, as a way of forestalling that, is actually Kim's solutions, North Korea's solution. You don't mess around with people who have nuclear weapons. And that's what actually the sort of the right wing in Iran, the Ahmadinejad's line would have been if they'd articulated it. They were too smart not to articulate it, but that was their position. And they're taking the moderates to task on this issue. But they're saying, if we had nuclear weapons, Trump wouldn't mess around with us like this.
Hi, could you talk about the role of Qatar in all this and the alliance between Iran and Qatar and what and how that's playing out?
Qatar. Yeah, again, here you see actually a question of imposing of power. Qatar was part of the Gulf Defense Corporation, which was created by the United States to bring in the Gulf states, the Saudis, against Iran. But Qatar basically developed its own foreign policy that was somewhat friendlier to Iran, not really that close to Iran, but it didn't go along toe the line with the Saudis. The Saudis then got furious. How dare you, tiny little state, cross us? So we're going to teach you a lesson. We're going to blockade you. So it's a way of basically imposing, acting like a hegemon, U.S. hegemon, but a local hegemon on Qatar. But Qatar doesn't have military power, but it does have enough money to survive. And an embargo there hasn't worked because it has access from Iran to Iran. And there are also other complications. There's, of course, U.S. The largest U.S. naval base in the world is actually in Qatar. So it makes sense for the United States strategically to support Qatar rather than Saudis. But Trump didn't know that probably. And then what the Qataris have done actually is invited a lot of Turkish troops to come in. So if the Saudis try to invade, they're going to have to deal with the Turkish army there.
I guess I'm interested in what your view is on what's happening in Syria and why Russia is there, why Iran is there, and what you think should happen. I mean, my understanding of why Russia and Iran are there is because they're being engulfed by the U.S. from every side. So this is like one way of fighting the U.S., like a proxy war, as Phyllis Spanish would put it. So I guess I'd like to know your views on Syria.
All right, first about North Korea. I don't think really it's related that way. What I think they probably think in Washington is the crisis with Iran is a long-term thing. It's not going to happen in the next 6 months or a year. It's something basically go in the next 2 years. So by then, they would have some sort of face-saving solution about North Korea. Okay, so the North Korean situation would have been resolved before the Iranian crisis really blows up. The Syrian situation, actually a bit hard. I did need a lot of time to explain because the media here has completely distorted it, including the responsible press. The media here presented the Syrian crisis as a popular uprising against a vicious dictator. Okay, Assad is a dictator. But when you put it in that perspective, automatically the notion is the people opposing the dictator are good guys. But if you know anything about Syria, that was a very dubious premise to start with. True, the first demonstrations were done by basically, you could call them secular reformers and stuff. But the movement was quickly taken over by jihadists. So the question then is, do you support a brutal secular dictator, Assad, or do you like to support a bunch of jihadists who want to cut off heads? And their slogan was Christians to Lebanon, Alavis to the grave. Okay. So it's a sectarian conflict. And when you're faced with that choice, who are the good guys? And the notion here was somehow U.S., at least the humanitarian interventionist, was that U.S. had a sort of duty mission to support the opposition without really looking at who is the opposition. And the opposition then broke into two. One group were the Caliphate, okay, Mosul, ISIS is called, I prefer to call them the Caliphate, that's what their name was, and why not call them the Caliphate? And then the good guys were the Bin Ladenist, Al-Qaeda. The guys who gave us September 11th become then, they changed their name conveniently, probably advice of Washington. We had a new face and were then presented as the real force against Assad. But they were as much jihadists as the Caliphate. So in that choice, the Russians actually, having experienced in Lebanon, what had happened in Lebanon, they had supported Gaddafi, and what they thought they would actually replace Gaddafi with something reasonable. What happened in Syria became a complete mess. They therefore didn't want to be burnt again in Syria, and they had also traditional links with Syria. So they didn't want to lose that. Iran's situation is actually even deeper. Iran has had good relations with Syria since 1980. When Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, the only major Arab country that didn't support Iraq was Syria. So they have that basically attachment to Assad. Even though Assad is a secular socialist, Arab nationalist, Iran is a Muslim Shia state, that religious issue wasn't there. It was quite political. Here was a state that had supported Iran. Iran, therefore, needed to support them. And also, Iran, to support Hezbollah, had to use the transit of Syria. And then when the civil war started in Syria, the jihadists were out to destroy all the Shiite shrines. There aren't many Shias in Syria, but they're important shrines, graves in Syria. And for Iran, this then became, you can say, an emotional issue. And their argument was they're sending volunteers, not so much to support Assad, but to defend these shrines. So at present in Syria, again, this idea that Iran is a major power, that Iran is really controlling Syria. Iran is a hegemon in Syria. That's often the term is used. Iran has 2,000 military advisors in Syria. So if 2,000 makes them a hegemon, then obviously the United States must control the whole world many times over. What also Iran does is to defend those sites and helps Assad. They have tried to get volunteers from other Shia communities, from Iraq and from Afghanistan and even Pakistan as volunteers to go to Syria. So they do spend some money on that, but it's not huge expenses. Again, the idea in Washington is if you financially squeeze Iran, they'll have no choice but to withdraw from Syria, as if Iran is pouring billions of dollars into Syria. It doesn't cost much to pay volunteers to fight in a country. So basically, it's not high-tech, expensive. People volunteer. What it is, you have to pay basically benefits if they're killed to their relatives. Again, you're not talking about big bucks. You're talking about money that any state can spend. The Syrian case was very badly covered, even by the New York Times. The money that poured in, I mean, you could see this, the jihadists had unlimited weaponry, and it was all coming from the Gulf, but it was also American weaponry. Okay, the State Department would say, well, we know nothing about this. The fact is, when a country buys American weapons, they have to sign an agreement that they're not allowed to pass on the weapons to another country or another. So they either were breaking that contract or doing it with the permission of the State Department. And then you see actually the escalation of the crisis in Syria. That when did the Russians really come in? They come in when suddenly the jihadists had an unlimited supply of anti-tank weapons. These were American anti-tank weapons. When that came in, it changed the balance because it meant that the Syrian army that relied on tanks was very vulnerable. At that point, the Russians came in with their air cover to protect the tanks. So there has been escalation in Syria, mainly basically driven by the Gulf and United States, and the Russians and also Iranians have been reacting to that. If that hadn't been that tremendous inflow of American weaponry, Assad would have dealt with the crisis in the first 6 months. Gaddafi would have done the same thing. But it was only due to outside intervention that the crisis became a full-blown crisis. So what is ironically saying is the example is used that Iran, proof of Iran's expansionism is its presence in Syria. Iran's presence in Syria is mainly due to American and the Gulf intervention there. If it hadn't been that, Iran wouldn't have had a foothold in Syria, really. And the same goes along, of course, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and also in Lebanon. The Lebanese Hezbollah was created because of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Before that, there was no Hezbollah. So if you wanted to get rid of Hezbollah or dissolve Hezbollah, the Israelis should basically give assurances to Lebanon that they will never again invade Lebanon, which is not, they're not likely to give that.
Question is, what is the relationship of Iran with Turkey and Afghanistan? If you could talk a little bit about, where they stand today.
Well, with Turkey, it's basically ambiguous because Iran doesn't really know what Turkey is going to do. Turkey sometimes is supporting Assad, sometimes is not supporting Assad. At one time, Turkey was out to destroy Assad. Now they watered that down. So there's less friction about Iran and Turkey about that. With Afghanistan, Iran worked with the United States in setting up the Kabul government against the Taliban. Now, the rumor in Washington is that Iran is negotiating with the Taliban, as this is seen as a sign of sinister activities. But of course, the US is also dealing with the Taliban. So it's not like some sort of a very Machiavellian thing to do with the Taliban. If you want some sort of settlement in Afghanistan, you have to deal with the Taliban. So what Iran is doing is probably has contacts with the Taliban and wants to see what's happening there. And of course, here is one card Iran has, which I didn't deal with in the talk. If things escalate, besides Iran then throwing out the inspectors and going full blow for nuclear, as a less of a drastic act, Iran can actually then needle United States in its weakest points. US is weak really in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon. And in all those countries, Iran has so-called assets, and it doesn't have major power. It doesn't have armies there, but it does have influence to undercut US role. So I wouldn't be surprised if things get worse. Nasty things begin to happen to American troops in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, Lebanon. They would be vulnerable. And this is, I think, one reason the Pentagon is much more cautious about dealing with Iran. They don't want their troops basically used as hostages in a very hostile environment. And Iran could easily unravel the government in Afghanistan, basically the drop of a hat if it wanted to. So if it wanted to have a scene where, like the Vietnam scene with helicopters over the rooftops, evacuating people from Kabul, it can actually do that because it has enough assets in Afghanistan to do it.
Wow.
So that's one trump card Iran could play if things get worse. Going back to actually the question of the base. The base, I don't think that was that important to the Russians. It's an old base. It's more like a worn-out dock. It's not a major naval base. Once the escalation started, the Russians in Syria came in for air bases rather than a naval base.
But still, it's access to water. I mean, it's an important access.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, but I think they would have other accesses too. I don't know. I don't know. The Navy is not that important for the Russians. The Air Force is.
Our Fifth Fleet in Qatar, and also if you look at the map that came with the flyer for tonight, it's about a dozen U.S. military facilities ringing or along the western side of the Persian Gulf. So I'm wondering, and certainly historically that was a crucial sea route for oil tankers and whatnot. But you seem to suggest that oil is really not much of a factor. I understand your idea about the U.S. projecting power, geopolitical power, whatnot, military power. But then why so many bases? Is it just to encircle Iran and threaten them, or is it to interdict oil at crucial moment? What are all those bases really about?
It's a good point, because actually I've heard military experts saying during the Obama administration, saying that those bases basically are no longer needed. What's the point of them? They're expense. They're not serving any function, and basically we should withdraw. And I think Obama's long-term strategy was when he said U.S. footsteps in the Middle East should be less, it was about reducing those bases. For him, the strategic areas for the United States was the Pacific, not the Persian Gulf. So I think in a way it's a sort of a hangover from the past when oil was important, and there was an obsession that somehow American oil was drying up, and the only way for national security in America was to have access and secure oil routes, Persian Gulf. But I don't think that important these days, because there's so many other sources of oil. Even if the Gulf was cut off, there's still, Middle East oil could come out elsewhere. There's so many pipelines. The consequences are actually, if you look down the road, especially in this question of sanctions, what U.S. has now is a tight grip over the international financial system. So that any country, any company that wants to deal with a country that's under sanctions, Iran or so on, it can be really throttled by the United States because the US controls so much of international monetary system. And that is going to cause the Europeans to think about the present monetary system. Sooner or later, they're going to come to the decision that the monetary system that was set up after World War II, where the center of gravity of economics was the United States, US banks were dominant, was the normal, that is no longer true. Economic gravity has moved to China. There are so many other basically economic centers, and the banking system is a vestige already in the 1950s. And there will be, I think, serious talk about system that the dollar and the American banks are not going to be there. Because here, let's say you're a French company and you want to deal with Iran, you can't because you'll be penalized because the US banks could penalize you. So what sort of sovereignty does France have if that is true? This is not going to save Iran in the short run, but in the long run, you're going to eventually get a sort of maybe a de Gaulle of France that will say, well, it's time to break off ties with the dollar. We need a different economic system where we can be much more independent of the United States. But I mean, it's been building up because more and more European countries have got pissed off because they can be really penalized with billions of dollars of penalties because they do something that politically Washington doesn't like. The best thing is we can do is be actually educated audience and listen first of all to information. So much of the information when it comes to crisis situations is nowadays called fake news. But fake news is nothing new. It's always there, especially in foreign policy. So one has to be very careful on judging the information and always be skeptical about it. So when the president gets up and says, well, Iran might nuke our cities. You have to test, what's he talking about? You know, where is this information? Does Iran have nukes? Does it have the missiles to nuke us? It's simple facts like that as a citizen has to do, is to be aware when people are talking bullshit. And then from then you can criticize the policy. But you first of all have to recognize that it's nonsense. And of course we went through this with the Iraqi. Before that we went through the Vietnam. And really, I don't think basically nothing was learned from it. It was, any administration comes in, the view is that the masses are asses. You can really fool them into anything.
Right, right. So how do we say no right now before the war even gets started? How do we say no emphatically to our government who will not be part of this right now? Not wait till later. No, there's no wait. How do we say it right now as citizens? Because we got you and those countries depend on us to say no now, say no not to dare try that method of going to war.
The best thing we could do is, I mean, there's no war emergency. No one's talking about war. The best thing we can do is what we're doing now is point out that the policy, the road they've already set, is going to lead to war. So people's awareness what lies down the road. So they not suddenly wake up one day and discover the prices have gone up.
A couple of things I would like to, I don't know, call attention to is I would expect that what would happen with Iran is what Israel has already tried to do, which is to provoke Iran's presence in Syria, where Israel claimed that it was Iranian forces in Syria that had attacked Israeli forces, which the Syrians then said, no, that was us. So I think we all need to be on the alert for false flags, for attempts at provocation of Iran. And, you know, Syria to me is like a cauldron. I mean, people, you know, a lot of people talk about that this looks like World War I all over again. And I think it's a very complicated situation. I think the main thing that we need to do is to continually challenge the official story, wherever, whether in letters, getting on the radio, this kind of thing, writing articles, and speaking to people to reject the official story that Iran is any kind of a threat to the United States, and that you know, it's the United States that's the greatest threat to world peace. And that, it's the United States that's the greatest threat to world peace.